Hello guys, welcome to screencast on the last part of gaseous exchange and diffusion. So far we've looked at gaseous exchange at the alveoli, both at rest and exercise, and we've looked at gaseous exchange or diffusion at the alveoli during exercise. Now, what we've got to look at, is today's lesson. We're going to look at internal respiration. You don't really need to worry about that, but what we really need to look at is the fact that we're looking at internal respiration or muscle tissue respiration or muscle tissue diffusion of oxygen, particularly during exercise at the muscle tissue. So that's the key focus. That should be exercise. Sorry, that's a mistake by me. So basically then, during exercise, muscle tissue diffusion, basically we have to concentrate on the following things. So the substance that carries oxygen in the blood is oxyhemoglobin. Okay, so basically we've talked about that before. How is oxygen carried in the blood? It's carried via hemoglobin, and that is called oxyhemoglobin. So there is an association between oxygen and hemoglobin to form that substance. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? The fact that we talked about how, because there was a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli during exercise and a lower partial pressure of oxygen in the blood during exercise, that meant there was a steeper diffusion gradient, so you had faster oxygen diffusion into the blood. So now what we've got then is this high saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin in the blood. So what we're looking at during exercise is, because we have this higher saturation of oxygen, we now need to think, right, we have to get this oxygen where it is most needed. The whole process of gaseous exchange and diffusion is ultimately aimed at getting oxygen to the working muscle. That's what we need it for. That's what allows us to perform at our maximum, and it allows us to perform aerobically for as long as possible. Now, fortunately I think, so it gets you to show how good you are at something in a real tough exam question. But basically, there's in order to release the oxygen from the hemoglobin, which is the carrier of different gases, we basically have to dissociate the oxygen. So it's called oxyhemoglobin dissociation. Now, all the things we've done before, we've talked about GASP-DD. That's been our focus all the way through. For exercise, we've exaggerated. When you see muscle tissue diffusion during exercise, you know that you've got something different, and we have to talk about this oxyhemoglobin dissociation. Now, the tough bit, you don't need to get too caught up in the diagram, I certainly don't. Basically, this is kind of what you would have as a normal oxygen hemoglobin association. Okay, so basically you've got saturation here and you've got a partial pressure of oxygen here. So what we're saying then now is, all you have to know, you don't really need to ever draw this curve. It might be an exam question, but you don't even really need to understand. All you need to know is that during exercise, basically more oxygen is diffused from hemoglobin. So if we imagine, what happens is this curve moves to the right. So see where it says a right shift there. During exercise, because there is a higher saturation of oxygen with hemoglobin, that means the more oxygen is diffused into the working muscles, because we have more oxygen in the first place in the blood, and we have a low partial pressure of oxygen in the muscle cell. So because there is a higher saturation or higher PPO2 in the blood, this causes a steeper diffusion gradient. Now, what we have to do is, unfortunately, you can't just talk about the GASP-DD protocol for this one. We have to talk about something slightly different. And the reason why there is such an enhanced or exaggerated shift or dissociation of oxygen into the working muscle is because of 4 key factors. So the picture's called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, okay, which is obviously a bit of a mouthful. I will give you a really, really kind of concise way of remembering this tomorrow. But basically, the reason why the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, e.g. the amount of oxygen that's dissociated from oxygen, moves to the right more during exercise, is due to 4 key factors. These 4 factors, okay, so if I put it onto here, so I've said on this, you're looking for muscle, exercise, well, I'll tell you why you need that tomorrow. So basically, these are the key focus. There's more oxygen available for diffusion, so there's a higher PPO2 in the blood. This causes the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve to move to the right. This is caused by some things that change. Imagine you're exercising now. So basically, first thing that changes is your blood and muscle temperature increases. And because of the blood and muscle temperature increasing, this causes an increased kind of diffusion of oxygen from the blood into the muscles. And I always liken this to the fact, if you wash up, okay, you wash up dishes and you wash them up with cold water, and you look at kind of whatever's stuck to the plate, it will stay there. Okay, the cold water doesn't do anything to it. If you imagine when you put hot water in, as soon as you put that hot water in, you start to see the kind of whatever's stuck to the plate disintegrate and dissociate and move into the water. So it's very similar with kind of oxygen and hemoglobin. So you think about that concept of an increased blood and muscle temperature leading to an increased oxygen diffusion. The next thing that happens is when you're exercising, there's increased blood acidity. Okay, so for example, you'd have more lactic acid in your blood. So because of that more lactic acid being like kind of attached into the blood, that means that it pushes the oxygen away from the hemoglobin and into the muscle cell. Next, the C talks about the partial pressures of CO2. So as we know, because we've got a high PPO2 in the blood and a low PPO2 in the muscle cell, we know that on the flip side there must be a high ppCO2 in the muscle and a low ppCO2 in the blood, leading to a steeper CO2 diffusion gradient. So there's some similarities, as you can see here, to what we've done before with the GASP-DD protocol. So now what we're saying then is oxygen. This is the key thing. See, the CO2 you might not even need to use in the exam. The key thing we're talking about in oxygen is that there is a high PPO2 in the blood and a lower PPO2 in the muscle. This leads to an increased O2 diffusion gradient from the blood to muscles. Now all of these aforementioned factors, all of these factors before this, TACO, as you can see there, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. There is an acronym. I'll explain how we're going to use that tomorrow. Because there's a high PPO2 and lower PO2 in the muscle, this oxygen diffusion gradient from blood to muscles increases, it's steeper, we get faster diffusion. So all of the aforementioned factors basically do the following. So if you imagine hemoglobin, as I spoke to you before when talking about smoking, hemoglobin is attracted to oxygen. Fact. That's how it's carried around. However, what happens is that hemoglobin can get very quickly attracted to other things. So what happens is when this heat increases, when the acidity increases, when the CO2 diffusion gradient from muscle to blood increases, and when the O2 diffusion gradient from blood to muscle increases, these things suddenly start to reduce hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. And what happens is oxygen now starts to think, well, hang on a minute, I don't want to really be with hemoglobin, I need to get somewhere else, I need to dissociate. So what happens is that dissociates into the kind of muscle cell and via a substance called myoglobin. And myoglobin is kind of what carries and diffuses the actual kind of gas of oxygen into the muscle cells and allows us to perform. So ultimately, I've talked quite a bit about this. What you need to have down for tomorrow for the lesson is to say, right, there's certain things we're focused on here. This is it, kind of, first thing, more O2 available for diffusion, high PPO2 in the blood. Then we need to talk about oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve moves to the right. This is caused by 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we need to say that there's a reduced affinity between hemoglobin and oxygen, leading to oxygen dissociation into the muscles via a substance called myoglobin. This is a luxury item, myoglobin. If you can remember it, fantastic. We will also try and fit in altitude tomorrow. Okay, so that will be our next thing, but I'm not going to screencast that. Thank you.